a bridesmaid's dress unmistakably tailored for a young woman of slender figure, someone not much older than Felicity herself, though the cut belonged firmly to a bygone decade. The lavender satin shimmered faintly in the dim church lighting, like something that had been waiting a long time to be found. Felicity clasped her hands together, the way one might if suddenly confronted with a small ghost. "It's vintage," she said, her voice wavering between admiration and apprehension. "But why leave it here?" Purbright did not immediately answer. He lifted the dress with the careful respect one affords old things whose histories have not yet declared themselves. Something small fluttered loose, a place card, the kind used at formal dinners, its edges softened with age. The ink was faded but legible enough, for the one they forgot. Reverend Winstanley gave a soft exclamation that was almost a cough. "Dear me, that seems a trifle ominous." Harold, attempting gallantry, put an arm around Felicity's shoulders. Some sort of joke, surely. Students, perhaps. "Students rarely favour 1950s bridesmaid attire as part of their mischief," Purbright remarked mildly, tucking the place card between two fingers. "And they are seldom so neat about it." There was a collective silence, the sort that settles when everyone becomes aware they might be witnessing the beginning of a story they'd prefer not to be part of. Even the heating pipes, moments ago hissing with elderly enthusiasm, seemed to pause. Mrs. Alma Chubley, who had been bustling about the rear of the church, arranging hymn books and dispensing unsolicited opinions, now approached with the brisk interest of one who specializes in other people's mysteries. Her hat, decorated with an aggressive quantity of artificial berries, wobbled with each decisive step. "What's all this, Reverend?" "Oh, a dress! How peculiar! Well, people leave the strangest things in churches. Only last month someone abandoned a set of golf clubs behind the choir stalls." "These are older than golf clubs, Mrs. Chubley," Purbright said, his tone still polite, but probing. "Do you recognize it?" "Certainly not," she declared, though her eyes lingered a moment too long on the lace trim. "Although it is the sort of colour young ladies wore in the 50s, bridesmaids especially. My cousin Vera had something frightfully similar, rather unflattering on her complexion, but she insisted." Her monologue broke off as she spotted the place card. She leaned closer. "For the one they—" "Oh." Her voice faltered unexpectedly. "My word, that's quite pointed." "It is," Purbright agreed. Harold cleared his throat. "Inspector, do you think this is meant for us, for our wedding?" Despite his best attempt at nonchalance, worry threaded through his words. "Hard to say yet," Purbright replied. "Though it seems meant to be found, whoever left it chose a rehearsal rather than—"
"An empty church." Reverend Winstanley gave a flustered nod. "Perhaps we should continue the rehearsal. There's still the procession to practice and, well, the church will not decorate itself." But the atmosphere had shifted. Felicity kept glancing at the dress as though it might speak. Harold looked ready to hide it beneath a pew cushion. Mrs. Chubley, who nearly always wished to be involved in anything mildly scandalous, seemed unusually subdued. Purbright folded the dress back into the paper with deliberate gentleness. "I'll take this with me for the moment, Reverend. Best not leave it lying about." Yes, of course," Winstanley agreed, relieved at the transfer of responsibility. "Inspector, do you suppose it's connected with that form you came for?" "Unlikely," Purbright said dryly. "The disappearance of 2 parish bicycles rarely inspires this level of creativity." A faint flutter of nervous laughter rose among the group, like pigeons startled from a rooftop. Even so, no one appeared keen to resume wedding practice. Reverend Winstanley, who prided himself on pastoral sensitivity, recognized the futility of attempting to coax enthusiasm from a suddenly superstitious congregation. "Perhaps," he said gently,
We should adjourn to the hall for tea. Mrs. Worsfold has prepared a tray of scones." The mention of scones, that most stabilizing of refreshments, seemed to help everyone breathe again. They drifted toward the side door, though each cast at least one backward glance toward the parcel now tucked beneath Purbright's arm. Outside, the late autumn air felt crisp and rather more real than the charged stillness inside the church. The short walk to the hall was accompanied by strained attempts at cheerful conversation, remarks about weather, flower arrangements, the peculiar difficulties of herding small nephews into ring-bearing roles. Only Mrs. Chubley remained silent. She walked a fraction slower than usual, stopping once to adjust her glove, though it was perfectly fitted. When Felicity turned to include her in a comment about seating charts, Mrs. Chubley startled, as though jolted from a distant thought. "Oh yes, quite," she murmured, then hurried ahead toward the hall door. Purbright watched her go, not with suspicion, but with the quiet curiosity he reserved for moments when someone behaved just slightly outside their usual pattern. Patterns, domestic, social, emotional, were often more revealing than fingerprints. Inside the hall, the comfort of polished wooden floors and the smell of tea did much to restore normality. Felicity and Harold sank gratefully into chairs, whispering reassurances to one another. Reverend Winstanley busied himself with saucers. Mrs. Worsfold, guardian of the scones, beamed at the arrival of potential eaters. Purbright placed the parcel on an empty table beside the biscuits, unwrapping it only far enough to ensure the dress remained undamaged. Several parish ladies pretended not to stare. Harold approached, cup in hand. "Inspector, do you think someone's trying to frighten Felicity? A prank with poor taste." "Possibly," Purbright said, "but pranks usually aim for amusement or irritation. This feels more like prompting." "Prompting?" Harold echoed. "A tap on the shoulder from the past," Purbright said, "or from someone who wishes the past to be noticed." Harold looked uneasy. "We've no connection to the 50s, at least none that would involve bridesmaids. My parents married in the 70s and Felicity's in the 90s. Purbright nodded, which makes the timing intriguing. He left it at that, for speculation could do more harm than silence. Instead, he allowed his gaze to drift again to Mrs. Chubley. She stood near the hatch, speaking to Mrs. Worsfold, but her shoulders were held too tight, her laugh slightly too bright. He had seen similar demeanours around Flaxborough, a peculiar tension worn by those who feared a conversation they had not yet been invited to join. When Reverend Winstanley finally approached with the signed parish bicycle form, Purbright accepted it with a small smile. "Thank you, Reverend. I'll see myself out shortly." Yes, and Inspector, do let me know if the parcel turns out to be anything serious. We wouldn't want scandal before the wedding." "No," Purbright said mildly. "Flaxborough has always preferred its scandals after major events, not before them." He saw several parishioners glance sharply in his direction, uncertain whether he had been joking. He had. Purbright rewrapped the dress, slid the place card into his pocket, and left the hall with the unhurried tread of a man accustomed to untangling quiet oddities. Outside, twilight had begun its slow creep over St. Seraphina's churchyard, softening headstones and casting long shadows over the gravel. Nothing stirred except the faint rustle of leaves and, somewhere unseen, the brushing of a branch against an old window pane. "Forgotten bridesmaid?" Purbright murmured to himself, studying the church as if it might offer clarification. "Forgotten by whom, I wonder, and why remembered now?" The breeze carried no reply, but in Flaxborough silence was rarely empty. It usually meant someone, somewhere, hoped very much not to be asked a particular question. Purbright walked slowly toward the station, the parcel tucked beneath his arm, a quiet puzzle waiting for its unraveling. By the following morning, The bridesmaid's dress had travelled further around Flaxborough than any of the parish bicycles it had temporarily displaced in Purbright's attention. The inspector, who had placed the parcel safely in his office, was scarcely halfway through his first cup of tea when Sergeant Malley entered, wearing the look of a man struggling to corral information that refused to stay tidy. "Morning, sir. I expect you've heard." Purbright looked up mildly. "The wedding rehearsal? Yes, I was there." "No, sir. I mean what they're saying about it now." "Ah," Purbright murmured. "Rumours achieve their own velocity. What version has reached you?" Malley consulted an invisible list. That the dress was a warning, or a curse, or a message meant for someone who died. Some say it's connected to that old scandal in '58, though no two people agree what the scandal was. "Reassuringly consistent," Purbright said, setting down his tea. "Did anyone mention the words actually written on the place card?" "They did," Malley said grimly. "But, sir, depending on who you ask, the one they forgot is anything from an abandoned fiancé to a murdered child to a bridesmaid who ran away to join a travelling circus." Flaxborough has always excelled at imaginative interpretation. "It's getting worse by the hour." Purbright suspected as much. Rumours in Flaxborough were not spread deliberately, they simply grew like moss wherever a whisper found shade. By mid-morning he decided it would be prudent to speak with Reverend Winstanley and, if possible, intercept the more theatrical versions before they gained additional limbs. He found the vicar in the church hall attempting to coax a recalcitrant kettle toward boiling. Winstanley's expression brightened upon seeing him, though it was the flicker of a man who hoped a burden might be responsibly reassigned. "Oh, Inspector, thank goodness, you wouldn't believe the morning we've had." He gestured helplessly toward a group of parish women huddled near the notice board, whispering with the gravitas of conspirators. Purbright approached them with gentle inevitability. Several backs straightened. One woman attempted to conceal a folded sheet of paper which, despite her efforts, clearly bore the title "Forgotten Bridesmaid Identified." "Ladies," Purbright said affably, "you seem to be engaged in research." A murmur, some nods. Mrs. Penrose, always the boldest, stepped forward. "Inspector, we merely thought it best to prepare ourselves, in case the incident has implications." "For whom?" "That depends," Mrs. Penrose said, lowering her voice theatrically, "on whether the dress relates to the Thorndyke wedding or to the other matter." "Which other matter?" Purbright asked, watching their faces. "The Bickley wedding of 1958, she declared. "Surely you've heard." He had heard many versions over the years, none of them entirely reliable. A feud between bridesmaids, a runaway groom, a fainting fit so dramatic it altered 3 family fortunes. Flaxborough could never agree on the details, only that something faintly embarrassing had occurred. "And what connection do you propose?" Purbright asked calmly. "Between that event and a parcel left in a church 70 years later?" The women looked at one another, silently debating whose speculation might be least mockable. Finally, Mrs. Penrose spoke again. "There was, they say, a girl who should have been bridesmaid, a cousin, but her name was never written down. Something happened, and they pretended she never existed." "Convenient," Purbright said. "If true." Mrs. Penrose bristled at the neutrality of his tone. "Well, there is no harm in being informed." "Indeed not," he agreed, "though there is considerable harm in deciding too quickly what one is informed about." The women retreated into uneasy murmurs, leaving Purbright free to join the vicar at the hatch, where Mrs. Worsfold was dispensing tea with the expression of one who considered herself custodian of both refreshments and collective sanity. "Inspector," she said without preamble, "I don't care what anyone else says. That dress was left by someone who wanted forgiveness. You can see it in the stitching." Purbright inclined his head. "Interesting. Most people believe it to be a declaration of grievance." "Oh, there's grievance in it," Mrs. Worsfold said, pouring tea with decisive accuracy. "But not all grievances are meant to cause trouble. Some are only meant to be noticed." Before he could respond, the hall door opened abruptly, and Felicity Thorndyke herself entered, cheeks pale beneath her scarf. Harold followed, carrying a basket of order of service drafts that appeared to have suffered under the strain of recent events. "Inspector Purbright?" Felicity asked, approaching with an anxious smile that didn't quite hold. "I'm so sorry to intrude, but we felt we ought to speak with you." Purbright gestured to the empty table near the window. They sat, Harold placing the basket aside with visible relief. "It's just that," Felicity began, twisting her gloves. "People have been saying things." Harold nodded firmly. "We don't believe any of it, of course, but it's unsettling hearing strangers repeat details before we've even had breakfast." "What sort of details?" Purbright asked. "That someone left the dress to insult us," Felicity said, "or warn us, or hint that one of our families, particularly mine, has secrets." Her cheeks flushed at the last word. "Ridiculous, of course, but people talk as if they know everything." "Ah," Purbright said gently. "In Flaxborough, certainty requires neither evidence nor reason, only enthusiasm." That coaxed a quick laugh from Felicity, which seemed to steady her. "But Inspector," Harold said, leaning in, "what do you think? Is it connected to us? Or to that old Bickley story everyone suddenly remembers?" "I think," Purbright said, "that whoever left the dress wanted attention, but attention is not always the same as malice." Felicity exhaled, relieved, and yet still uneasy. "Then you believe there's more to learn?" "I usually do," Purbright said. "But not all mysteries wish to be solved quickly. Some prefer a polite introduction before revealing their nature." Before either could respond, the hall door opened again, admitting Mrs. Alma Chubley. Unlike the previous evening, she did not stride. She hesitated in the doorway, scanning the room as though deciding whether to enter at all. When she finally approached, she wore a brittle smile. "Inspector, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never, Mrs. Chubley," Purbright said pleasantly. She held herself carefully, as though every gesture might betray too much. "I only wondered whether you had discovered anything about the parcel." "Only that it is older on the outside than on the inside," Purbright replied, "and that it has caused more conversation than a new bell rope." Mrs. Chubley's smile stiffened. "Well, yes, people exaggerate." "Frequently," Purbright agreed, watching her composure with quiet interest. "I imagine someone will soon claim the dress is haunted." "They already have," Harold muttered. Felicity sighed. "3 times." Mrs. Chubley gave a quick, tight laugh. "Nonsense, of course, but people love a story." "They do," Purbright said, "particularly when the real one hasn't yet been told." Her eyes flickered, just briefly, but long enough for Purbright to notice. She excused herself moments later, departing as though keen to escape before further questions could be asked. Felicity watched her go. "She seems unsettled." "Half the town is," Harold said. Purbright stood, smoothing his coat. "Then we must hope the other half remains calm. Rumours thrive on imbalance." "And you, Inspector?" Felicity asked. "Do you think this will escalate?" Purbright considered the question with the mild, thoughtful air he often used when withholding his true assessment. "Rumours," he said, "rarely fade of their own accord. Something or someone usually resolves them." He left the hall with unhurried steps, fully aware that Flaxborough's appetite for speculation would not abate until nudged in a particular direction. and for that, he suspected, he would need to speak with the Bickley family far sooner than they might prefer. Purbright began his inquiries that same afternoon before the rumour mills could grind the story into complete fiction. The Bickley family still occupied Briar Lodge, a detached Victorian house whose neat gravel path and precisely trimmed hedges suggested a household determined to maintain dignity at all costs. When the inspector rang the bell, he heard the faint rustle of curtains inside, an instinctive retreat or reconnaissance depending on temperament. Mrs. Edith Bickley opened the door with the cautious politeness of someone who expects either a charity collector or a complaint. Upon recognizing Purbright, she arranged her expression into a smile so practiced it looked almost embroidered. "Inspector, what an unexpected visit." Purbright inclined his head. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bickley. I hope I haven't come at a difficult moment." "Well," she said, glancing behind her as though checking for anything that might be considered difficult, "we were just about to have tea. Do come in, if it's nothing alarming." "It isn't alarming," Purbright assured her. "Merely a small matter connected with the church." Her shoulders relaxed visibly, though the smile remained stitched in place. She led him into a drawing-room abundant with doilies, antimacassars, and the faint scent of lavender furniture polish. Her husband, Mr. Cyril Bickley, sat in an armchair near the fireplace reading the Flaxborough Gazette with the solemnity of a man deciphering scripture. "Cyril," she said lightly, "the inspector has come to ask about the church." Mr. Bickley peered over his spectacles. "Oh? Something stolen this time?" "No theft," Purbright said, settling into a nearby chair. "A parcel was left during a wedding rehearsal yesterday, containing an old bridesmaid's dress." Both Bickleys stiffened, though in different ways. Edith's teacup halted halfway to the saucer. Cyril raised his brows in a manner intended to appear casually curious. "Old?" Cyril repeated. "Plenty of old dresses about. People keep the silliest souvenirs." "This one seems to have been deliberately placed," Purbright continued, along with a note reading, "For the one they forgot." Edith's teacup met its saucer with a small but decisive clink. "Well," she said, "that sounds like a prank." "It might be," Purbright agreed, "though I wondered if it reminded either of you of anything, perhaps a family wedding long ago." Cyril folded his paper with exaggerated care, a preamble to saying something that he hoped would appear authoritative. "Inspector, if every parcel in a church were investigated, you'd never have time for real crime. And as for weddings, ours was decades ago, perfectly ordinary." "Indeed," Purbright said, "but I was thinking of the 1958 wedding, a relation of yours, I believe?" Edith's hands tightened on her lap. "Oh, that," she murmured. "Goodness, people still talk about it." "Only in the way people talk about anything that happened before they were born," Cyril said briskly, with too much imagination. "Of course," Purbright said. "But the rumours mention a bridesmaid, one who was expected but didn't appear." The silence sharpened. Cyril cleared his throat. "I don't know who told you that. There were plenty of girls bustling about that day. No one missing, to my knowledge." Edith smoothed her skirt, avoiding her husband's gaze. "It was a long time ago, Inspector. People forget details." "Indeed," Purbright said softly, "except when someone wishes a detail to be forgotten." Her eyes flickered, just briefly, but enough. She opened her mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, and stood with a decisive clatter of her pearls. "More tea?" "Thank you, no," Purbright said, rising. "I won't keep you. But if anything does come to mind, even something seemingly trivial, I'd appreciate hearing it." Cyril escorted him to the door with exaggerated courtesy. "Of course, but I wouldn't put stock in these rumours. People love a mystery, and they'll invent one if necessary." Quite, Purbright said, but sometimes the invention is less fictional than it appears. Outside, he paused on the gravel path, listening to the faint sound of a window latching shut above him. People rarely closed windows during harmless conversations. His next call was on Felicity Thorndyke herself. She lived with her mother in a semi-detached house overlooking the park, the sort of place that boasted framed watercolors of unspecified landscapes and a hallway rug that attempted to disguise its age with vigorous patterning. Felicity answered the door with a nervous smile, clearly still uneasy from the morning's gossip. "Oh, Inspector, please come in. I've been thinking about what you said." Her mother, Mrs. Thorndyke, appeared almost immediately, as though summoned by the prospect of information. She was a brisk woman with a talent for arranging her face into expressions that conveyed deep concern with only the slightest effort. Inspector Purbright. "Such a strange business, this dress. I do hope it won't overshadow the wedding." "Strangeness rarely overshadows weddings, Mrs. Thorndyke," Purbright said calmly. "It merely adds character." Felicity, blushing faintly, led him to the sitting room. "I don't know if it means anything," she said, settling beside her mother, "but the colour of the dress, lavender. My grandmother mentioned once that bridesmaids wore lavender at her cousin's wedding, though I suppose that was the style then." Her mother said sharply. "Lots of people wore lavender. It doesn't mean anything in particular." Purbright nodded. "Do either of you know if your family attended the Bickley wedding?" Mrs. Thorndyke's reaction was almost too quick. "Absolutely not. We barely knew them. Different social circles." Felicity blinked. "But Mother, didn't Grandmother used to say she once visited Briar Lodge?" Her mother shot her a warning glance. "She visited everyone. It doesn't signify." Purbright's tone remained mild. "I understand, but sometimes families know more history than they realize." Mrs. Thorndyke rose abruptly. "Can I get you tea, Inspector?" "No, thank you. I only wanted to ask one more thing. Has anything gone missing from your house recently? Old photographs, keepsakes, anything from before your time?" Felicity frowned, looking to her mother. "Well, actually," her mother cut in. "No, nothing at all. We keep our things in order." Purbright regarded her for a quiet moment. "Very sensible." He left mother and daughter exchanging tense looks, each uncertain what the other might be hiding or protecting. As he walked back toward the station, the sky settling into a muted grey typical of Flaxborough afternoons, he turned the questions over in his mind. The Bickleys uneasy, the Thorndykes defensive, Mrs. Chubley uncharacteristically subdued. Each reaction carried something incomplete, as though each household held only a fragment of a picture none wished fully revealed. He reached the station just as the street lamps flickered on. The parcel waited on his desk looking perfectly innocent, perfectly folded, perfectly placed. "For the one they forgot," he murmured again, sitting down. But someone, he felt sure, remembered perfectly well. By midday the drizzle had retreated, leaving the pavement slick and reflective, as though the town had been freshly polished for scrutiny. Purbright had barely finished noting his observations about the stitching when a knock sounded, brisk and purposeful. Councillor Harcourt entered without waiting to be summoned, his expression conveying both civic urgency and a touch of self-importance. "Inspector," he declared, removing his gloves with theatrical gravity, "I believe I can save you considerable time. I know who left that dress in the church." Purbright motioned toward a chair, though Harcourt remained standing, as if sitting might dilute the impact of his revelation. "And who might that be?" Purbright asked mildly. "Linnet Parlow," Harcourt announced. "The dressmaker. Odd woman, eccentric, and unquestionably the type to meddle where she shouldn't." Purbright folded his hands. On what grounds? Harcourt produced a folded scrap of paper from his pocket. I have here a receipt, satin ribbon, lavender, purchased 2 days ago. Purbright examined the receipt politely. And how did this come into your possession? She dropped it outside the post office, Harcourt said, lowering his voice in a manner he clearly believed confidential. Very careless. People who involve themselves in mischief usually are. I see. Purbright set the receipt down. Have you spoken with Miss Parlow? Certainly not. It's hardly my place to interrogate suspects. But the woman restores old gowns for a hobby. Everyone knows that. Dabbles in historical garments. I dare say she enjoys creating a little drama. Purbright let the man's certainty hang in the air for a moment before asking, You believe she wished to disrupt the Thorndyke wedding? Harcourt gave a small, satisfied nod. Jealousy, perhaps. She's never married, you know. I imagine weddings are uncomfortable for her. Purbright murmured. An imaginative theory. Not imagination, Inspector, deduction. She had the means, the materials, and the temperament. You must admit it's tidy. Tidy, yes, Purbright agreed. Occasionally too tidy. Harcourt frowned, not accustomed to having the neatness of his conclusions. Questioned. Well, I thought it my duty to inform you. The townspeople rely on us, on you, to keep order. I trust you'll deal with Miss Parlow before rumours grow worse. They seldom grow better, Purbright said. But I'll speak to her. Harcourt left with a faint bow, self-satisfaction radiating from every step. When the door closed, Purbright sighed, softly, tolerantly. Convenient suspects were rarely the right ones. They merely offered the comfort of an immediate answer. And Flaxborough, as ever, liked its answers, quickly boiled and neatly served. Still he made his way to Miss Parlow's shop on Willow Lane. The bell above the door chimed with a tiny, apologetic sound. The shop was a narrow, tidy space filled with bolts of fabric, jars of buttons, and mannequins draped in half-finished garments that seemed to be waiting for permission to speak. Miss Parlow herself stood behind the counter, adjusting a row of new bodice forms. She was a small woman of indeterminate age, with hair pinned so tightly it appeared incapable of disobedience. "Inspector," she said at once, without surprise, "I thought you might come." "Oh?" Purbright replied. "Why is that?" "People talk," she said simply. "And when people talk, they point fingers. Mine are easy to point at. Too solitary, too fond of old things. Harcourt's been sniffing around since morning." Purbright offered a small, sympathetic nod. "He brought me a receipt. Lavender ribbon." "Yes," she sighed. "I bought ribbon to repair a vintage gown for a client in Brimley. Nothing mysterious there. I do that sort of work all the time." "And the bridesmaid dress in the church?" Purbright asked gently. Her eyes widened, genuinely startled. "Inspector, I would never leave a garment in a church, especially not something so charged. I restore history, not exploit it." Her hands trembled slightly, not with guilt, but with an emotion far older and deeper. Fear of accusation, perhaps, or fear of being misunderstood. "I believe you," Purbright said quietly. "But you seemed uneasy when Mally spoke with you yesterday." "Yes, because someone came to see me the night before, someone I hadn't seen in years." Purbright paused. "Who?" Miss Parlow shook her head. "I can't say. Not yet. It isn't my secret to give." But she was distressed, very distressed. She asked if I still worked with old dresses. "And did she bring one?" "No," Miss Parlow said firmly. "She didn't bring anything, but she asked strange questions about making something look its age, about stitching that resembled the old clergy patterns." Purbright felt the small gears of understanding begin to shift. Did she mention the Bickley family? Or the weddings of that era? Miss Parlow hesitated. She asked if I remembered the Bickley wedding and whether I still had any of the old photographs I used for references years ago. She swallowed, but when I told her I didn't, she left abruptly. Distressed, you said? Very. Purbright nodded, thoughtful. Did she use rose-scented cold cream? Miss Parlow blinked. She did. I recognized it from the moment she stepped inside. A trivial detail, yet unmistakable. Mrs. Chubley. Purbright allowed no reaction to show. Instead, he thanked Miss Parlow, assured her he saw no cause for suspicion, and stepped back into the afternoon light, where the drizzle had returned just enough to blur the edges of the cobblestones. So the convenient suspect had served her purpose, not guilt, but direction. The real puzzle lay with someone who hid nervousness behind chatter, who fussed with gloves, scented faintly of roses, who had once moved comfortably within the circles of old Flaxborough households. Someone who knew what had been forgotten and feared what might be remembered. The following morning brought with it a muted drizzle, the sort that seemed determined not to fully commit to rain, yet succeeded in dampening both pavements and spirits. Purbright arrived at his office early, more out of habit than urgency, and set the parcel containing the bridesmaid's dress upon the table beneath the window. The satin looked even older in the grey light, its lavender shade subdued into something closer to faded heather. He unfolded the dress once more, careful not to disturb the folds more than necessary. As he lifted the hem, something caught his eye, a line of stitching, slightly uneven, yet done with a distinct, looping pattern. Not the work of a modern sewing machine. He had seen similar technique only once or twice in his career, always in older ecclesiastical garments made by retired members of a long-disbanded clergy sewing circle. He leaned closer. The thread was new. Someone wanted the dress to appear unchanged from its time, someone who understood just enough of the old stitch to imitate it, but not enough to fully replicate the original. It was a small thing, barely notable to anyone who did not spend quiet hours observing human precision and human error alike. A knock sounded at his door. Sergeant Malley entered, damp from the drizzle, and wearing the expression of a man expecting a puzzle, but hoping for a simple explanation. "Morning, sir. I've spoken with Miss Parlow." "Ah, the dressmaker," Purbright said. "How did she take the matter?" "Nervously," Malley replied. "She says she's never handled anything of that vintage recently, claims she's been doing curtains and cushions all month, but she looked jumpy." "Jumpy? Well, sir?" Malley scratched his head. "As if she expected you to arrive before I did." Purbright folded the hem again. "Did she mention the sewing circle?" "She did, actually. Said her aunt used to belong to one years ago. St. Hilda's, I think she called it." "St. Hilda's," Purbright murmured. Disbanded in 1964, their stitching was considered a sort of parish trademark. Malley blinked at the dress. "You mean this stitching?" "Yes, or rather a modern attempt at it." Malley considered this with wide-eyed respect, as though the dress was suddenly speaking in code. "So, someone altered it recently?" "Quite recently, perhaps days ago." He lifted the dress fully from the paper. The satin gave off a faint scent, not unpleasant, but unexpectedly floral. Purbright hesitated, then raised the fabric to his nose. Rose, but not like perfume, heavier, more medicinal. "Cold cream," he murmured. "Sir?" "A very particular kind, rose-scented. I recall it faintly from the church hall. A teacup Mrs. Worsfold set aside yesterday bore the same fragrance." Malley frowned. "Mrs. Worsfold left cream on a teacup?" "Not Mrs. Worsfold," Purbright corrected gently. "Someone who drank from a cup she later collected. Someone who uses that cream habitually." He laid the dress flat again and thought of Mrs. Chubley, the stiffness in her movements, the strained laugh, the momentary touch to her cheek as though recalling something. She had fussed with her gloves repeatedly, and she had been the first to approach the parcel, the first to linger on the lace, but he did not allow the thought to settle fully. Too early yet. One must collect change before offering a conclusion. "Mally," he said, "would you mind checking with Mrs. Worsfold? Casually, of course. Ask if she recalls who sat at which table yesterday morning." Mally saluted, an unnecessary flourish but enthusiastic, and hurried out. Left alone, Purbright studied the dress once more. The hem was not the only detail amiss. Near the waist seam, a tiny thread stood proud, untrimmed. The person who had altered the dress had been anxious. Hurried hands always left secrets behind. A trivial detail, yes, but trivialities were often the hinges upon which human concealment swung. He placed the dress back into the parcel and tied the ribbon loosely. Then he walked to the window, observing the street below, as early shoppers shuffled past under umbrellas. Somewhere in the town that same rose-scented cream would be resting on a vanity or tucked into a handbag. A small detail, easy to overlook unless one was looking for it. At 11, Mally returned, slightly breathless. "Sir, Mrs. Worsfold says only one person used the teacup with the rose scent." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "And who might that be?" "Mrs. Chubley," Mally said. "She had 2 cups, one right when she arrived and one when she left." Purbright nodded slowly. "Just as expected." Not enough for certainty, not yet, but enough to draw a faint outline. He thanked Mally and dismissed him. "So, Mrs. Chubley, involved in church matters, always close to every gathering, every whispered discussion, every budding rumour, and now connected by a faint scent and a nervous demeanour to address no one wished to acknowledge. But Purbright did not. Hurry! Haste bruised truth. Better to allow these small details to guide their own procession. He returned to his desk, smoothing the paper around the dress, the hem, the cream, the stitching, each small, odd, and telling. Someone had tried to make the past visible again, someone who remembered far too well for comfort. The town of Flaxborough, as Purbright knew from long experience, possessed a remarkable capacity for quietly nurturing secrets, each neighbour tending to them like a private garden. By late afternoon, it became clear that the story of the lavender dress had rippled beyond the Bickley and Thorndyke households, attracting attention from a variety of local characters whose presence could not be ignored. Purbright began with Mrs. Alma Chubley. She was ensconced in the church hall again, ostensibly supervising the arrangement of floral displays, but Purbright noticed immediately that her attention was divided, her eyes frequently flicking toward the door as though anticipating someone or something. He approached without preamble. "Mrs. Chubley," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded careful listening. "May I have a word?" "Oh, Inspector," she said, attempting a light tone, "I was merely checking that the carnations are properly aligned. Nothing more dramatic than that, I assure you." "I hope so," Purbright replied, "though you seemed concerned yesterday." He observed her gloves as she fidgeted, noting a faint trace of the same rose-scented cream he had detected on the parcel. "Might I ask what weighs on your mind?" She paused, her lips pressed together, considering whether to answer. "Well, one does get anxious when old matters resurface, even if they have been carefully forgotten. Nothing more, I assure you." Her gaze darted to a group of parishioners assembling tables for tea. Purbright smiled faintly to himself. She was a woman who believed in controlling her audience, yet her nervousness betrayed her despite every careful gesture. Next, he sought Mr. Plowright, the widower who lived at the edge of town, rarely seen outside unless prompted by necessity. His house, perched behind high hedges, looked almost neglected but for the meticulously swept path. Plowright answered the door before Purbright could knock a second time, holding a cane and surveying the inspector with sharp, pale eyes. "Inspector," he said, "I suspected I might hear from you soon." "You suspected correctly," Purbright said. "I wanted to ask if you noticed anything unusual yesterday morning at the rehearsal or nearby." Plowright considered for a long moment. "There was a lady in the churchyard at dawn. She was crying softly. I could not see her clearly, but she seemed agitated." He shifted his weight, one foot tapping ever so slightly. "I didn't approach. People have their reasons for mourning quietly." "Did you recognize her?" "Not immediately. She seemed familiar. Somehow, though memory is a treacherous companion." His eyes narrowed. Perhaps someone connected to that old wedding scandal. Purbright thanked him politely and moved on. With each visit, the web of Flaxborough's past grew more tangled, yet simultaneously offered subtle hints: a name mentioned in passing, a photograph glimpsed in a window, a gesture held just a fraction too long. He noted all of it. At the Bickley residence, he returned to clarify minor inconsistencies, inquiring specifically about a missing box of old photographs. Mrs. Bickley admitted with some reluctance that she had indeed removed them from the attic several days ago. "I thought it best to keep them safe," she said. "Old images often cause more trouble than they are worth." "Safe from whom?" Purbright asked gently. "From curiosity," she admitted. "Some things are best left forgotten." That phrase, repeated across households in the course of the day, was an echo Purbright stored carefully. Meanwhile, the florist's assistant, a young woman named June Maltravers, provided another puzzle piece. She had overheard a whispered conversation between Mrs. Chubley and the bride's mother, Mrs. Thorndyke, concerning a family. Matter best not aired, though she was unsure of the details. Her tone suggested no malice, only eagerness to be helpful. Yet in her account Purbright detected both tension and over-exaggeration, a combination that often marked the edges of the truth. He compiled each observation. The rose-scented gloves, the nervous gestures, the evasions, the whispered mentions of photographs and family secrets. Each character introduced an element, small, almost incidental, that subtly expanded the field of those connected, directly or indirectly, to the dress. The town's layers of propriety, gossip, and cautious concealment were beginning to form a map, with the corners still shadowed, yet increasingly coherent. By evening, Purbright found himself in the modest parlour of the Thorndyke home once more. Felicity had been silent for most of the day, absorbing the undercurrent of speculation, while her mother busied herself with a kettle and biscuits. He sat quietly, allowing them to settle, knowing that calm observation often elicited far more than direct questioning. "Inspector," Mrs. Thorndyke said eventually, "I do hope we are not making too much of nothing." "Sometimes nothing, when observed closely, becomes something entirely revealing," Purbright said. He allowed the statement to linger, then added gently, "And often those who feel forgotten make their presence known in subtle ways." Felicity's brow furrowed. "You mean someone is trying to remind us of the past?" "In a manner of speaking," he said, "though the intention may be quite different from the effect." Outside, the last light faded, and the streets reflected lamplight in thin ribbons along the cobblestones. Flaxborough had introduced him to Mrs. Chubley, Mr. Plowright, the Bickleys, and June Maltravers, all bearing fragments of the story. Each character, seemingly peripheral, contributed to the intricate lattice that would eventually reveal the heart of the matter. Purbright returned to his office with the parcel once more, the satin of the dress lying flat on the table. He allowed his gaze to wander to the door, knowing that each person who had passed through the day carried with them knowledge, misremembered details, and emotional footprints. These were the markers that would guide him toward clarity. The web had expanded, and the subtle tension between those who spoke too much and those who said nothing at all was beginning to outline the true pattern. In Flaxborough, where silence often weighed heavier than confession, the smallest gestures could betray the largest truths, and Purbright, patient and observant, was noting each one with deliberate care. By the time he finally set aside his notebook, the evening air had grown cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The town, in its habitual quiet, was settling for the night, unaware of the careful scrutiny that would soon begin to untangle its delicate, hidden complexities. Every character he had encountered was a thread, and the tapestry, once fully observed, would reveal a design far older and subtler than any of them suspected. The following morning dawned with an unassuming clarity, the sun piercing thin clouds with a polite insistence that promised little more than ordinary errands and the occasional puddle reflection. Purbright arrived at St. Seraphina's church, not out of necessity but curiosity, the sort born of accumulated observations that insisted upon attention before speculation hardened into story. He found the church vestry door slightly ajar, a circumstance that immediately piqued his attention. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing displaced in a manner suggesting hurried search or vandalism, yet inside the desk drawers and shelves bore a subtle disorder, a pen out of line, a ledger half open, a hymnal resting askew upon a chair. The subtlety of the disturbance, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, was precisely the sort of clue that captured Purbright's attention. "Sergeant Malley," he said, entering the vestry. "Have you noticed anything unusual this morning?" Malley, already examining a ledger with the care of a man unsure which detail mattered most, shook his head. "Nothing obvious, sir, though some pages of the parish marriage register are missing." Purbright's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. "Missing?" "Yes, sir. A page from 1958, right where the Bickley wedding entries are kept." He examined the ledger himself. The torn page left a jagged gap. The ink of the remaining entries bore the usual calm script of the vicar's hand, yet the absence of that single page transformed the ledger into a subtle accusation against an invisible hand. "Who had access last?" Purbright asked. "Reverend Winstanley, of course," Malley replied, "and Mrs. Chubley, since she often tidies the vestry. No one else, ordinarily." Purbright murmured. A convenient suspect had become more complicated. He traced the page's absence with a careful fingertip along the edge of the ledger. No lingering fingerprints, no smudges of ink. Whoever removed it had done so deliberately, quietly, and with minimal disturbance, precisely the traits of someone well practiced in caution. He moved toward the altar to consider the parcel from yesterday, the lavender dress. In contrast to the ledger's stark evidence, the dress remained meticulously folded on a pew. The placement and the care taken in wrapping it were now entwined with the torn register page, linking two acts separated by intention rather than opportunity. Malley's voice interrupted his thought. "Inspector, the vicar says he saw Mrs. Chubley arrive early this morning. She asked if the vestry needed tidying." Purbright nodded, his mind assembling a lattice of timing, presence, and subtle action. "She was alone?" "As far as anyone saw, yes." He allowed a moment of silence, considering the juxtaposition. A woman anxious about propriety, a ledger page removed, and a dress that had been deliberately placed. Each act small, each act deliberate, each act creating a shadow upon the town's carefully maintained narrative. Purbright's attention drifted to a small table by the vestry window. A teacup sat half-filled with cold water, condensation forming a delicate halo on the polished surface. He remembered the rose-scented cream, the trivial detail that had whispered of human anxiety, and wondered how it might connect to the current disturbance. He stepped outside, the chill air sharpening his focus. A faint trace of rose lingered, carried by the morning breeze from the hall nearby. He observed passers-by, shopkeepers arranging goods, a boy delivering newspapers, a woman cycling past, her hat tilted slightly in the sun. Each movement, each presence, was a marker of time in a town whose citizens had perfected the art of appearing unconcerned. Purbright returned to the vestry and began cataloguing small observations. The ledger's missing page, the dress, the teacup. Minor, seemingly trivial, yet collectively insisting upon significance. The second incident, the removal of the register page, shifted the inquiry. It suggested that the first act, leaving the dress, was insufficient to satisfy some internal compulsion. Someone wished to obscure, alter, or otherwise influence memory, and now the act was escalating beyond subtle prompting. The inspector considered the psychological implication. The first parcel had been a gentle prod, almost a nudge, toward remembrance. The second was deliberate erasure. The hand that performed this was careful, precise, familiar with the routines of the church and with the people who had long forgotten, or hoped to forget, the events of 1958. Malley frowned. "Sir, do you think this is connected to the bridesmaid, or something else entirely?" Purbright studied the ledger, the sunlight reflecting faintly across the torn edges of the missing page. "I suspect both," he said quietly. "The dress and the register are threads of the same fabric. Someone is determined that a particular narrative, long buried, should either be acknowledged or concealed. It is the motive that will guide us more than the means." He traced the jagged edge of the page with a fingertip, noting the precision. Whoever had removed it understood the importance of leaving no obvious sign. The act itself was a message. The past cannot remain entirely buried, yet it is vulnerable to selective memory. The thought lingered as he straightened and stepped toward the door. Outside, the town carried on, shop doors opening and closing, children running past school gates, an elderly couple walking their dog along the cobblestones. Flaxborough, in all its ordinary bustle, seemed unaware that its quiet equilibrium had been punctured twice in less than 24 hours by small acts, barely perceptible, yet profoundly revealing. Purbright replaced the dress gently in the pew, leaving it untouched but newly significant. Each detail, the hem-stitching, the rose-scented trace, the missing register page, now formed an interconnected lattice leading toward truths not yet acknowledged. He understood that the investigation required patience. The culprit's anxiety, their choices, and their interactions with others would ultimately point the way, if he watched carefully enough. As he left the church, the drizzle had returned, soft and persistent, coating the streets with reflective light. He noted, without remarking aloud, that Flaxborough's secrets had a way of returning at dawn. Some hidden motives demanded recognition, and others suppression. Yet both now had begun to make themselves felt, almost imperceptibly, across the town, and Purbright, observing quietly, knew that each small act, the dress, the page, the scent, was part of a deliberate narrative that would not unfold in haste. Patience, attention, and subtlety would be required to untangle the intentions behind these carefully orchestrated disturbances. That evening, Purbright sat alone in his office, the parcel resting on the desk before him like a silent witness. The lamplight fell across the folds of the lavender satin, highlighting the delicate hem and faint traces of new stitching. Outside, Flaxborough was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the muted patter of rain against window panes. In such moments he found clarity, not in chatter or reports, but in the solitude that allowed the mind to sift through observation and intuition alike. He considered the various players he had encountered over the past few days. Mrs. Chubley, fidgeting with gloves scented faintly of rose. The Bickleys, evasive yet precise in their recollections. Felicity and her mother, unsettled by whispers and fragments of history. The dressmaker, concerned yet honest. Even Mr. Plowright, the widower, who had seen a woman crying in the churchyard at dawn. Each bore a fragment of truth, and each in its incompleteness risked misdirection. Purbright reflected on human nature in small towns. There was a peculiar art in the careful cultivation of reputation, the delicate balancing of appearances, and the management of memory. People in Flaxborough seldom lied outright, they simply omitted what might disturb propriety or awaken shame. Yet in omission, as he knew well, the mind often compensates, embellishes, or misremembers. One could read the unsaid, the gestures and the timing as if they were written lines in a story, and in that narrative motives could be discerned. The parcel and the missing page of the parish register were twin signs, both small acts, deliberate and precise, suggesting someone was keen to shape memory itself. The dress, with its vintage lavender, its newly executed clergy-style stitching, and its faint rose scent, was an appeal or a confession, perhaps both. The torn page implied urgency, a need to erase or redirect attention. Each sign, though trivial in isolation, collectively implied intent, and that intent he suspected was personal, not malicious. An attempt to reconcile the past without creating scandal in the present. He thought of Mrs. Chubley, whose nervousness had been almost imperceptible, yet consistent across interactions. Her preoccupation with arrangements, her slight tremor when questioned, her faintly floral scent. They were small markers, but they repeated in a pattern. Patterns, Purbright knew, were more revealing than statements. People often spoke in honesty through gestures when words were insufficient or dangerous. The Bickleys' caution, while outwardly protective of memory, hinted at an awareness of omissions they could not entirely explain. Even their insistence that nothing unusual remained from the past seemed rehearsed, as if anticipating questions from someone like him. He noted the subtle difference between those who deflected out of fear and those who deflected to conceal error. Mrs. Chubley's anxiety belonged to the latter category, careful, deliberate, and shadowed by a long memory. He returned his attention to the dress. The stitching, though new, was faithful to an older style. Someone had gone to considerable effort to replicate detail, to signal connection to the past without stating it outright. And yet the rose-scented cream betrayed human presence, the subtle, unavoidable signature that impatience or carelessness leaves behind. It suggested urgency and emotional involvement, not mere mischief. Purbright thought about the broader social mechanics at play. Small towns, he reflected, were capable of gentle cruelties, memories curated, people forgotten, reputations quietly edited. Yet they were equally capable of delicacy, restraint, and subtle restitution. Someone had left the dress as a form of recognition to remind the town of a presence once erased. The missing page indicated fear that recognition would unsettle those still living, fear that truths long buried might disrupt current order. He leaned back, considering the intersecting motives, embarrassment, guilt, nostalgia, and care, all intermingled in a lattice too complex to untangle with accusation alone. The solution would not arrive through force, but by allowing the concerned parties to reveal themselves under the proper conditions, to speak when the social circumstances encouraged honesty. Finally, Purbright allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Flaxborough, with all its carefully maintained decorum, had revealed enough already. The pieces were in place, though not yet fully aligned. Patience, observation, and a precise, gentle nudge would be required to clarify which fragment belonged to which story and to whom. The town's equilibrium would guide the resolution as much as any detective's inquiry. He extinguished the lamp briefly to gaze out the window at the rain-streaked streets. Each shadowed doorway, each quiet window represented someone with memory, motive, and hesitation, all potential keys to the unfolding mystery. With the soft ticking of the clock and the gentle patter of rain as companions, Purbright returned to the parcel. He ran his fingers lightly over the folds, noting the weight and texture, the subtle implications of care and precision. The past, he reflected, had not been forgotten. It had merely been waiting for acknowledgement. And in Flaxborough, as always, acknowledgement required tact, patience, and an understanding of the invisible threads that connected human action, intent, and emotion. Purbright would trace each one carefully, quietly, and without haste. The following morning, Purbright arranged a seemingly ordinary gathering at the church hall, ostensibly for a minor discussion of seating and floral arrangements for the upcoming wedding. Invitations had been extended with casual civility. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested scrutiny or suspicion. Yet in Flaxborough, the smallest pretext could conceal purpose, and Purbright relied upon that subtlety. By mid-morning, several key figures had arrived. Mrs. Chubley, already adjusting ribbons and gloves with almost obsessive care. The bride's mother, Mrs. Thorndyke, glancing between her daughter and the hall as though to ensure propriety. The Bickleys, quiet but attentive. And June Maltravers, the florist's assistant, standing slightly apart with a notebook in hand. Each was aware of the lavender dress, though the parcel itself remained tucked behind the inspector's desk, out of immediate view. Purbright allowed the initial chatter to continue, offering polite observations on flower placement and seating arrangements. No one paid him particular attention, which suited his purpose. The gentle murmur of conversation provided both cover and contrast, allowing small gestures, glances, and hesitations to reveal what words often concealed. At a moment he deemed precise, he moved toward the center of the room, clearing his throat lightly. "I wonder," he began, "if anyone recalls a bridesmaid at the Bickley wedding of 1958, one whose presence seems to have vanished from the records." The room froze just enough for subtle reactions to ripple through the attendees. Mrs. Chubley's gloves trembled slightly as she adjusted them, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mrs. Thorndyke's brow furrowed, though she maintained the air of polite disinterest. The Bickleys exchanged glances, a silent conversation of apprehension passing between them. Purbright allowed the pause to extend. "It is curious how memory operates," he continued softly. "How one can overlook names, dates, even entire lives until something or someone calls them to attention." June Maltravers shifted her weight, eyes briefly meeting Purbright's. "It is true," she said quietly. "People often forget details that seem unimportant to them, yet are crucial to another." "Indeed," Purbright said, nodding, "and yet sometimes a detail is deliberately overlooked, whether out of embarrassment, shame, or protection. I have observed that this particular bridesmaid, whose name appears absent from the parish register, has elicited considerable anxiety." He walked slowly toward Mrs. Chubley, maintaining a calm tone and casual posture. "Mrs. Chubley, you have been attentive to every minor arrangement in this hall for many years. You notice details most others overlook." His eyes rested briefly on her hands, gloved, yet betraying the faintest tension. "I wonder if you might recall who used the rose-scented cream at the rehearsal tea?" Her fingers tightened on her gloves. "Inspector, I don't—" Her voice faltered, then she straightened. "Of course, anyone might have used it. I cannot be certain." Purbright inclined his head slightly, neither pressing nor retreating. "It is understandable. Memory is a fragile companion. Yet we often recognize patterns subconsciously. The scent of cream, the hem of a dress, the absence of a name, all speak louder than many spoken words." Mrs. Chubley's eyes flickered toward the door and then back at him, a brief lapse in composure that passed unnoticed by others but registered fully with Purbright. He allowed a faint smile, one that suggested only gentle curiosity, to soften his expression. Next he spoke to Mrs. Thorndyke. "And you, of course, have managed many family gatherings, yet you, too, might be aware of who has long remembered or forgotten the finer details of past events." Her hand rested lightly on the back of a chair, the knuckles white beneath her careful composure. She said nothing immediately, and in that silence he noted everything. Hesitation, subtle tightening of posture, avoidance of eye contact. Purbright returned to the centre of the hall, letting his eyes sweep the room casually, as though taking in the floral displays. "We are all prone to omission," he said, voice calm, almost conversational. "But when someone wishes a truth acknowledged, deliberately or inadvertently, it tends to emerge despite caution." Mrs. Chubley shifted again, the slight tremor in her hands now more pronounced. The faint scent of rose from the previous day seemed to cling invisibly, a signature impossible to conceal. Purbright did not point or accuse. He allowed the observation to exist as a gentle prompt, a mirror reflecting anxiety back to its source. He continued in mild tones, speaking of flowers, tables, and seating only intermittently, but always returning to the theme of memory, omission, and overlooked presences. Each comment was a subtle gauge, a quiet test of composure. The room remained outwardly civil, but the micro-expressions, the small gestures, and the careful avoidance of eye contact all spoke volumes. By the time the tea was served, the test had run its course. Mrs. Chubley, despite her best efforts, had betrayed enough discomfort to suggest deep personal involvement in the past she had hoped to remain hidden. The other participants remained cautious, yet the presence of tension was now palpable in the air, a lattice connecting their knowledge, their hesitation, and the choices they had made decades ago. Purbright observed quietly, sipping his tea with deliberate calm. The quiet test had revealed more than words could convey. The culprit, or at least the person most intimately entwined with the forgotten bridesmaid and the lavender dress, had responded predictably, not by speaking but by subtle gestures, silences, and a faint, lingering scent. It was exactly the evidence he required, though still not conclusive. In Flaxborough, patience was as valuable as perception, and a gentle prod could elicit more truth than direct confrontation. By observing reactions under carefully controlled circumstances, Purbright had achieved clarity without disruption, confirming suspicions while keeping the town's delicate proprieties intact. Purbright chose the vicar's sitting room for the final conversation. The room, modest and tidy, smelled faintly of polished wood and tea, with a gentle fire casting warm patterns over the walls. The participants arrived punctually. Mrs. Chubley, Mrs. Thorndyke, Felicity, and the Bickleys. Each sat with careful composure, as though expecting civility but uncertain of what form it would take. Purbright himself remained standing, leaning lightly against the mantel, as if the room and its inhabitants were part of a study rather than a confrontation. "Thank you all for coming," he began. His tone was calm, devoid of accusation. "I hope to speak plainly, though gently. You have observed unusual events, a parcel, a bridesmaid's dress, and, recently, a missing Page from the parish register. He allowed the words to rest in the air, watching the reactions. Small gestures revealed as much as any speech, Mrs. Chubley's fingers twisting lightly, Mrs. Thorndyke's brief flicker of unease, Felicity's wide eyes, the Bickleys' stiff nods. "The dress," Purbright continued, "was left deliberately, not carelessly. Its vintage lavender, the hem stitching, and the subtle fragrance all point to someone wishing to be remembered, to be acknowledged." He glanced at Mrs. Chubley. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and that someone, I am convinced, is connected to the events of the 1958 Bickley wedding. He allowed the silence to deepen. Every person in the room was aware of the significance, though the details remained murky. Purbright had noticed all their reactions in previous days, the hesitation, the small gestures, the carefully concealed anxiety. Now he drew those threads together, guiding them gently toward clarity. "Mrs. Chubley," he said finally, "you were involved in keeping certain details from memory. You helped to conceal the existence of a bridesmaid, a young woman named Hazel Penworthy. Do not interrupt. I am not reproaching, only observing. You acted, as you once said, to protect reputation and propriety. Yet the presence of this dress, left here for discovery, indicates that you wished acknowledgement without scandal." Her hands trembled beneath her gloves. "Inspector, She stopped, struggling with words she had long kept hidden. "I did it because it seemed right. Hazel was forgotten, and it should not have been. I meant no harm." Purbright nodded. "Precisely. That explains the parcel, the careful placement, the choice of church, the subtle signs, the hem, the fragrance. Each detail signalled recognition, apology, or at least remembrance." He turned slightly toward the missing page. "And the page removed from the parish register? That was intended, I believe, not to erase entirely, but to prevent the wider public from noticing, for fear that the past, once acknowledged, might disrupt the wedding." Mrs. Thorndyke interjected softly. I took it. I thought it best. We were afraid Hazel's connection would reach people who shouldn't know and ruin today." Her voice was controlled, but faint traces of guilt and anxiety remained. "I only wanted to protect my daughter and her wedding." "No one would understand." Purbright inclined his head. "Protection indeed. You acted swiftly and with what you believed prudence. Yet the truth has a way of asserting itself through small, careful signs, gestures, scent, even stitching." He gestured lightly toward the parcel on the table. The dress, placed with such care, carried the same message, acknowledgement of a life once ignored. Felicity, previously silent, spoke at last. "Hazel was my great-aunt." Her voice trembled. "I never knew. All this time she existed, and no one
mentioned her." "Yes," Purbright said quietly. "Hazel Penworthy attended the 1958 wedding as a bridesmaid, though her presence was deliberately forgotten. Circumstances arose, personal tragedy, a scandal carefully contained, and memory was edited accordingly. The parcel is the final attempt, by someone who remembers, to restore what was quietly erased." Mrs. Chubley's gloves shifted in her lap. "I wanted the world to notice her, even if only slightly, without causing grief or gossip. I thought, if someone had to remember, perhaps it should be the bride, and her family, privately." "And it was," Purbright said. "No scandal occurred. No one suffered public embarrassment. You acted, in your way, with sensitivity, acknowledging the past while respecting the present. The missing page, the careful stitching, the rose-scented detail, they were all extensions of the same intention." He turned to the Bickleys. "You too were aware of gaps in memory, of what had been omitted from family history. Your caution was expected.
Protecting memory, preserving discretion are virtues here, though they complicate recognition. Cyril Bickley nodded, expression muted but resigned. We sought to preserve order. As always, Inspector, discretion seemed preferable. Indeed, Purbright agreed, yet order and truth are not incompatible. In this instance, both were preserved, though with minor perturbations in the social equilibrium. Felicity took a deep breath. So all of this, the dress, the missing page, Mrs. Chubley's anxiety, it was never meant to harm anyone? Never, Purbright confirmed. It was intended to remind, not accuse, to restore, not disrupt. The gestures were subtle, the message careful, and as with most things in Flaxborough, the truth revealed itself only through patience, observation, and attention to human behavior rather than dramatic confession. Mrs. Chubley finally exhaled, visibly relieved. I feared judgment, she said, but now I see it was unnecessary. Hazel deserved recognition even if belated. Purbright inclined his head, his expression gentle. Recognition has been given. Quietly, thoughtfully, without the need for scandal. That is the way of small towns where reputation is cherished but truth, when handled delicately, finds its place. He allowed the group a moment of silence, each processing what had been revealed. The air, once taut with expectation, softened with understanding. The delicate lattice of past omissions, current gestures, and carefully managed memory had been untangled with precision and civility. Finally, he gestured toward the parcel. Felicity, Harold, keep the dress. Remember it for the sake of history, and for Hazel. Let it serve as a quiet acknowledgement of a life once overlooked, and of human intention carried through decades. Felicity took the parcel, holding it gently. Thank you, Inspector, I will. Purbright leaned back, lightly, as if concluding a lecture he had barely delivered. And thus Flaxborough maintains its balance. Past missteps are acknowledged discreetly, reputations preserved, and understanding, however belated, achieved. The room fell into quiet reflection. The minor disturbances, the parcel, the missing page, the subtle gestures had all found resolution. Human behavior, when observed carefully, had revealed more than accusation ever could. Small-town secrets had been illuminated, yet with gentleness and discretion, just as Flaxborough demanded. No one spoke immediately. The warmth of the fire, the faint scent of roses, and the quiet presence of carefully maintained propriety filled the room. It was a rare stillness, one that carried both relief and understanding, and that permitted the past to rest alongside the present without disruption. Purbright rose, straightened his coat, and allowed himself a faint, approving smile. The web of memory, omission, and deliberate gesture had been unravelled with patience, precision, and subtle observation. Every person involved understood, in their own way, that the past had been acknowledged, and that order remained intact. The town, he reflected, would continue on its usual path, carrying its small triumphs, minor anxieties, and human curiosities. Yet this particular thread, the forgotten bridesmaid, the lavender dress, the delicate gestures of acknowledgement, would remain a quietly resolved chapter in the town's collective memory. The wedding took place 3 days later with a calm that belied the quiet disturbances of the past week. St. Seraphina's church gleamed in soft daylight, the pews arranged with meticulous care, flowers placed as if rehearsed in every detail. The lavender dress rested safely in Felicity's hands, folded neatly, an emblem not of scandal, but of remembrance. Its presence had been explained privately, discreetly, to her satisfaction and to the quiet relief of her mother. Outside, Flaxborough went about its usual routines. Shopkeepers arranged their displays as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The postman delivered letters with predictable punctuality, children ran between school gates, and the church bells rang gently, marking the ordinary rhythm of time. Yet beneath the ordinary, subtle changes lingered, invisible to all but those who had attended closely to the small perturbations that had unfolded. Mrs. Chubley, for example, continued her duties at the church with the same brisk efficiency as ever. However, there was a gentleness to her movements now, a lightness to her expressions that had not been present before. The tension in her gestures, once so tightly coiled, had eased. She no longer lingered on trivial details with nervous insistence. Instead, she allowed small imperfections to exist, unremarked, acknowledging quietly that the past need not dominate the present. The Thorndikes, too, carried on with their preparations. Mrs. Thorndyke moved among the guests and helpers with a newfound serenity. She no longer cast fleeting glances toward the parcel or the Bickley family, secure in the knowledge that the matter had been addressed without disruption. Felicity herself seemed to bear a subtle confidence, a recognition that the threads of memory, once tangled, had been restored with discretion and care. At Briar Lodge, the Bickleys resumed their daily habits. Mr. Bickley returned to the routine of the newspaper and the armchair by the window, occasionally glancing at the garden with a faint smile. Mrs. Bickley, meanwhile, moved among the rooms with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the photographs, the ledger, and the minor disturbances had been understood without unnecessary exposure. Their sense of propriety remained intact, bolstered rather than undermined by the events of the past week. Purbright himself returned to his station and, finally, to paperwork. The parcels, the teacups, the torn register page, all had been accounted for in the delicate way he had foreseen. There were letters to file, minor administrative duties to attend, and the faint hum of routine to accompany his work. Yet even as he settled into these ordinary tasks, he reflected on the subtle transformations he had observed, how memory had been acknowledged, how anxiety had eased, how propriety had been preserved, while truth found its place. The florist, June Maltravers, continued to deliver flowers with meticulous precision. She had overheard whispers in previous days, but now moved with an ease unburdened by fear of inadvertent revelation. Mrs. Worsfold returned to her scones, humming quietly to herself as she laid them out on the polished tables. Even the church grounds seemed lighter, freer from the tension that had briefly occupied them. Flaxborough itself remained largely unaware of the precise resolution, and that was as it should be. Small towns thrive on the balance of appearances and private knowledge, and here balance had been restored. Yet for those who had been most closely involved, those who had acted out of conscience, discretion, or the gentle insistence to acknowledge what had been forgotten, the experience lingered, shaping their behavior subtly, quietly, in ways that no outsider could observe. Purbright noted these changes with quiet satisfaction. The town's equilibrium, delicate though resilient, had absorbed the disturbances without faltering. People continued to interact, gossip, and organize, yet the invisible threads of human memory and human conscience had been realigned. The past had been acknowledged, the present had remained stable, and the lessons of careful observation, discretion, and patience had quietly been reinforced. He spent the afternoon reviewing his notes, the dress lying folded on the side table. The hem, the stitching, the scent, all had been necessary, but nothing in excess. Every detail had served a purpose, acknowledgement without accusation, recognition without scandal. Flaxborough, with all its understated civility, had witnessed an act of subtle justice that no public record would ever fully capture. As evening fell, Purbright looked out the window at the town's streets, quiet now beneath lamplight. Children returned from lessons, shopkeepers prepared to close, and a gentle fog began to settle across the cobblestones. The church spire cast a long shadow, a silent sentinel over the ordinary rhythms of life. The parcel, the dress, the registry page, all were matters of memory now acknowledged and contained. In his own quiet way, Purbright allowed himself a small, private approval. The case had demanded attention to minor details, understanding of human behavior, and patient orchestration of circumstances. It had been resolved without accusation, without disruption, and without compromising the town's delicate social fabric. The forgotten bridesmaid had been remembered, the anxious parties reassured, and the town's routines remained intact, slightly enriched by knowledge they would scarcely admit existed. He rose finally, placing the parcel back in its cabinet, and turned to his papers. Routine tasks awaited, and for the first time in days, they felt genuinely routine. Outside, Flaxborough settled into evening, ordinary and orderly, unaware of how precisely the balance had been maintained or of the careful attention that had preserved it. And with that, Purbright returned fully to paperwork, the quiet satisfaction of resolution settling over him as he worked. The town, unchanged in appearance, had shifted subtly in essence, its secrets acknowledged, its proprieties preserved, its memories restored with gentle discretion. In Flaxborough, life continued calm, ordinary, and perfectly poised.